welcome to the Stanford D.School's Masters of Creativity series. I'm Jeremy Utley. I'm a member of the Executive Education team, which is hosting this series, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the session today. As you know, every month we invite spectacular practitioners of creative practice to share some of their tips and tricks. We've invited artists and entrepreneurs and authors and performers to come and share how they do their craft so that we all can learn and glean and grow on our path of creative mastery. Today, we are privileged to have the Stanford D.School's very own Executive Director, Sarah Stein Greenberg, and she's going to share about her amazing new book, Creative Acts for Curious People, which is a compilation of lessons and methods and reflections and insights built over the D.School's last 15 years. Joined with her today is New York Times bestselling author and longtime D.School collaborator, Bob Sutton, who will be interviewing her about her book and also giving you all a chance to ask questions. And we're excited to see where the conversation goes. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Bob and Sarah. Thanks again for being with us today.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great to be here. Welcome, everyone. My God, there's 323 of you. So lots of old and new friends, too. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to interview Sarah about her new book, Creative Acts for Curious People, which, as Jeremy said, just came out last week. She's fresh from her engagement at the Commonwealth Club last night, so she's making the rounds. We're lucky to have her. I kind of want to go through this in a few different acts. So first of all, I'm going to ask Sarah a little bit about herself. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the D.School, and then we'll get on to the main event and talk about some of the big picture behind her book and some of the elements. But one thing, just yesterday, Sarah and I and Jeremy too were talking about, well, how would we think of Sarah as a person? And obviously she's a complex person, but one thing that really strikes me as a thread throughout her, not just her career, but even her childhood, is that she's somebody who is really focused on building communities and tending to communities. So rather than doing the formal introduction, what I thought I would do is sort of quiz Sarah about what she learned about building community from, well, 3 or 4 major experiences. So let's start out with, well, the Quaker community. And I was asking, what's a nice Jewish girl like you doing at a Quaker community? So Sarah, what did you learn as a member of the Quaker community about building community?
Yeah, well, let me set the stage here. So first of all, I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. Bob, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I'm really excited to dive into Creative Acts and find out what all those Post-its are doing stuck all over your pages. But okay, so let's start with the theme that you raised around community. So I grew up in Philadelphia. I saw some Pennsylvania people in the chat earlier. So hi to all my Pennsylvania people out there. And Philadelphia actually has like an important, part of the founding of this country. A lot of interesting activity was happening, around Philadelphia. And I was really lucky to be part of the Quaker school system there. And, the Quaker philosophies are really about a very egalitarian view of community. So everybody has a voice, everybody has a role to play. And actually the style of worship is that you sit in silence, and whoever feels moved to speak, who feels moved by the light or the spirit, can contribute to that meeting and kind of testify. And that left a very strong impression on me as a child. And it's also where the fundamentals of consensus come from in a lot of cases. So Quaker meetings for business, where the organization will say, like, what are we going to? Are we going to open this new school? Are we going to take some kind of social action on this issue of the day? They run by a strict consensus, and that doesn't mean majority rules. That means if one person has an objection, you hear that person out completely. And as a result, decisions get made very slowly, but the emphasis is really on what are we going to learn from that one person who's seeing the situation differently, who has some kind of dissenting voice. That's important to understand. And I think both that emphasis on like raising up those voices that might be quieter in some situations, and just the idea of the process that you're using to make decisions has this tremendous relationship between, how your community is involving people and also in the quality of the decisions, and that efficiency is not what the value that is being prized there. So for me, that just like left an incredible mark in terms of the way that I think about the relationship between process and community and values.
That's quite striking. We never talked about this before. This also explains why you're actually quite a patient person. So that's quite interesting.
I literally, as a child, I had to learn how to sit in silence with, other members of my, like second grade class. And we're all, it's like, and by the time you get to high school, you're like, this is the best part of the week. I want that spaciousness, that silence, to be able to be both in community and also kind of in your own space and in your own mind.
All right. So that's the Quaker, the Quaker experience, which is actually quite informative. Then, well, you worked in the nonprofit world for a few years after you graduated, and then you came back to Stanford and you got your MBA. And that's where I think I first met you. You were a D.school fellow when we were in a double wide trailer with one bathroom and 75 or 80 people. So tell us what you learned about building community as a D.school fellow. And you were one of our original students from the very beginning.
I know, I got to take some of those classes that were truly experimental.
I
mean, it was amazing. It was really an amazing time. Yeah, I'll say, I mean, for me, having kind of a non-traditional business background, coming to the GSB, the Graduate School of Business, and being a little bit of an oddball, but then also realizing like everyone there thinks they're a little bit of an oddball. It was by far the most internationally diverse community I'd been a part of. And I think, part of what I was trying to deliberately experience was being out of my element and being with a group of people that really had very different work experience, very different understandings of the world than I did. And then finding the D.school was like, oh, I kind of found my people. Like, so I was having these two experiences of being kind of like a little bit of a fish out of water and also finding this like deep sense of belonging. And I think, for me, learning from those experiences is like, you need that sense of deep belonging. And also having that, one foot in that kind of community allowed me to be a little bit braver and bolder about how I was navigating the other part of my life at Stanford, where I was really stretching and kind of, learning in all of these new and challenging ways.
So maybe you could share just in a minute or less your famous Myanmar Project, because to me that was sort of the entry level drug for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I took a couple of those very early classes, and then I landed in one of the early classes at the D.school called Designed for Extreme Affordability. And that year, the whole class, the topic was around water and how to help small farmers irrigate their fields more effectively and less expensively. And we were partnering with an organization that's now called Proximity Designs, which is based in Myanmar. And I'll just say, I mean, that is an organization that is so completely human-centered. When you go and visit them and to, work on your research or work on your project with them, you get picked up from the airport, and immediately before you do anything else, you go talk to some farmers. So the idea that like the voice of the person who is going to be using the result of your design work, it is so firmly embedded in that organization. So my particular team was working on how do we make the frame, that the water pump that this organization was selling, more affordable and more effective. And so we just came up with this redesign in terms of like taking a lot of the metal and a lot of the cost out of that pump. And then we went back and we tested it with farmers. They told us a lot of great feedback about what would and wouldn't work. And then the folks in the workshop at the organization really kind of took it to the next level. And, we finished our class in June, and by October of that same year, there were 1,500 units in the fields already, really starting to be distributed. And we took about 50% of the cost out of that particular product. So for me, it was this moment of like, whoa, this design stuff, you can have real impact if you have the right partnership and you have the right team and you work really collaboratively with the folks in the community that you're designing with.
And that's sort of looking forward to the book, which we'll be talking about soon. To me, this sort of is the D.school spirit. that the rest of Stanford, which is, I spend honestly most of my time in the rest of Stanford, we talk about what we're going to do. At the D-School, you talk about it a little bit and you do really a lot of stuff. So that's a great example. Okay, so returning to this theme of community, maybe you actually were a management consultant for a few years there after you graduated. We never thought we would get you back. So tell us a little bit about, well, what did you learn about community being a management consultant?
I know that's not like, I think maybe people don't always put that idea of community together with management.
No, I sure don't.
But I will say, so I was very lucky. I was working for Monitor Group, which is now part of Deloitte. And at the moment that I landed there, Monitor had just acquired a design firm, this incredible firm called Doblin, based in Chicago. And they did it because, they actually were very early in recognizing a trend that has now really taken off, which is a lot of the large consulting firms, and frankly, a lot of, large corporations have absorbed pre-existing design firms because design has become so important in terms of driving value in companies and organizations. And what was very interesting to me was being at the intersection of the two different cultures, the culture within the design firm and the culture within a more traditional management consulting firm, and seeing how, there were two different systems of incentives. There were two different, even the idea for people of like, what does a successful career trajectory look like? Right? There are people in the design context who are like true specialists in human factors or in other kinds of more quantitative research. And there were folks in the Monitor, in the management consulting context, who their idea of career progression had to do with, eventually becoming an account manager and driving the business. And so even that sort of tension between what does a successful career look like, those things were really being negotiated and navigated to try to bring together these two very distinct cultures. And being at that overlap just made me hyper aware of how much you have to attend to those human concerns when you're trying to bring together two different communities and try to make both of them stronger.
Yeah, that's it. Interesting. And Jeremy and I were talking with you yesterday about being at the intersection. You're somebody who always seems to be at the intersection between two to 15, not necessarily in comfortable and compatible groups and values.
I don't know why I like that, Bob, but that's exactly what it's like at the D-School, right? We have students who are coming from all of the different disciplines and all of the different, the faculty cultures. And that is really a powerful learning, right? The culture that is surrounding a law student is very different from the culture and community that's surrounding a medical student or an engineering student. And so if you can harness those differences and you can build an environment where people can actually come together and use those different skills, like that's where some of the truly incredible solutions come from, but it's not trivial.
It's not trivial. And sort of moving towards the D-School, to me, it just having been involved since the beginning, the diversity is just astounding. And just Jeremy and Catherine were talking about the D leadership class that we've been teaching for about a dozen years. I think we've had students from 18 years of old to 70 something years of age in that class, and the diversity is remarkable. Okay, so now let's sort of move to the D-School. So you were a D-School fellow, much admired and much loved. You went away for a few years, and then we enticed you back into management. So now you're our executive director. So tell us, like, what's exciting to you about the D-School, and what have you learned about building community at the D-School, since that's kind of your job?
I mean, one thing that is exciting is the D-School is always changing, and we crave that. So we were talking yesterday and you said, I have a sense that things are different. And that my response was like, that should be the statement anyone could always make about the gap between when they last walked in the door and when they're walking in the door today or tomorrow. And I think that has been, a really essential part of how we've operated. I also think that as we have sort of grown bigger and tried to encompass more different communities and serve more different people, there's also been a need for, like, how do you establish enough regularity so that people can count on you, right? So that people kind of know you're going to be there when you say you're offering this class, you're going to offer that class, right? And so I think that's been really interesting to navigate over time. What's that balance between that kind of like creative chaos, it's always changing, anybody can do anything, and the need to actually really to show up for the people who want what you're offering. And so I think we're kind of always in the midst of navigating what's the right balance there between that regularity and what's new. And, one thing that I'll say that I'm excited about in terms of the future is, as design is being pulled into these, increasingly complex systems in the social sector, in education, some of the change that needs to happen just takes longer. It's different. It's a different time scale than just, kind of getting a product out the door or shipping something in a commercial context where everybody is aligned around a profit motivation. There's many more stakeholders in a lot of these places where design is starting to play a role, and the time scale is different. So that also raises interesting questions about how do we balance, the kinds of projects that we take on, the kinds of skills we're equipping our students with, about being able to embed for the long haul versus having those sort of like really powerful, fast moving, exciting learning experiences and kind of design cycles.
Well, so I love that, but also in that, just for those of you who some of you were involved in the D.school in the very beginning. I'm looking at Susie Wise in front of my screen, who was, I think, a fellow the same year that you were, and then was regular staff member for years. But still, one thing that I would really emphasize, and if you disagree, let me know. Our focus at the D.school is still innovators, not innovation. So Sarah did innovation when she did the Myanmar Project, but the key thing is producing innovators. And one thing I will say about the D.school, having been at Stanford for almost 40 years, 38 years, we're confused about many things at the D.school, but one thing that the D.school is not confused about is students are the main people that we exist for, not our research, not administration, although we do some of that stuff. Would you agree with that? Is that fair?
I would agree with that. I think we're hopefully really practicing what we preach, and that we really pay attention to what the needs of the students are, and even in like engage in sort of further out visioning projects about like what should education look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And it's that balance between being able to kind of like leapfrog and develop that really ambitious vision, but then also, sort of like put in the hard work that it takes to build the relationships in the communities, to pay attention to the sort of like that phrase about moving at the speed of trust. If you're looking to make long-term change, you have to pay attention to that. And, I feel like that's a really interesting tension to navigate in any kind of, innovator or innovation ecosystem.
All right. So I think that's enough about the D.school. Let's get on to the main focus today. Creative acts for curious people. So I don't know, it looks backwards on your screen. It does on mine.
Is there a method to your madness? Are those color-coded Post-its?
No, when I run out of one, I put in the other. And then you don't even see on my other screen, I have a whole bunch more Post-its too. And those are all for your book. Anyways, I got very excited about reading the book. So one of the things, continuing this idea of community, the thing that just amazes me, so my view of how I write a book is I go into actually the same room I'm in right now, and I hide and I don't talk to people. I don't even talk to my co-authors sometimes. I just sit here and type. But you have brought together the community in the process of doing this book. Just across my screen, I see Catherine, Jeremy, and Susie. Their ideas are explicitly in the book with dozens of others. So describe a little bit about your point of view in the book, kind of the big idea and the idea behind the process, which just amazes me because it really does read in your voice, yet it brings together this community of remarkable innovators and their innovations. So I'm just kind of like blown away from spending much of yesterday with the book.
Oh, that's so nice to hear, Bob. Thank you. It was really, really important for me from the beginning that if this was going to be a book that was like all about how and what we teach at the D.school, it was absolutely had to reflect our community and our community values. I mean, we're teaching students that creativity is a team sport. We team teach. We really rely on people's ideas that are coming from all different places to actually affect and influence, sort of like what's going to be next, and not just hold that sort of power centrally in the organization. And so I wanted to figure out, like, how can you express that in a book? And there are all of these myths around innovation and creativity. It's like the one person with the light bulb that gets it done. And I'm sort of like not interested in that version of how creativity works, because that's so not reflective of our actual experience at the D.school. So I from the beginning knew that I wanted to get, like, what are our best assignments that we give at the D.school, and more than just the kind of ideas and methods. Like, there are lots of great toolkits that are out there in terms of learning design and applying it, but I wanted to try to figure out the work that goes into teaching and creating a transformational behavioral shift for people at the D.school. Can we embody that in a book, right? So it's like, I want you to feel when you're reading one of Susie's contributions, like Expert Eyes, for example, which is one of the assignments in the book. I want you to feel the particular attention and the values that she has and that she brings into the classroom. When you're reading this assignment,
I sent that email, and then I got an email from Mark asking me to call him. Send him a note back, told him
I got that email too, I think.
I think somebody has a microphone on that they don't mean to have on.
I sent the email to everybody.
Yeah, maybe we can mute everyone. Okay, perfect. So it's like when you're reading one of, an assignment that Jeremy and Perry or Catherine contributed, like, they have a particular way of inspiring people to stretch beyond what they think they can do. And they set the conditions in their, environment in a very particular way. So I'm hoping that kind of, there's a little theater, there's a little bit of, empathy or warmth or humor, whatever that particular quality that teaching team has. I really wanted that to come through. And so to get there, I asked, we did a ton of interviews. I worked with this really, really talented researcher named Amalia Rothschild-Kaita. We did about 100 interviews. And then we really tried to figure out, okay, what's the best, sort of set, right? There were hundreds and hundreds more assignments that could have ended up in here. But I wanted to create the experience, like, a little bit of what going through a class at the D.school might be like, but there's also far more, there's more than 80 assignments in here. So it was way more than you would get in one class. And then the other piece that was really important to me was acknowledging everyone. So, like, I want everybody's name to go along with their work. And I am sure that unintentionally I missed some people, and I want to publicly apologize every chance I get for that. But the reality is, these ideas come from so many different people. And I think that makes the work stronger, and we should celebrate that at every chance that we get.
Well, so that's really quite striking, because thinking about this, and also some conversations I've been having with Jeremy lately, there's this notion that, yes, creativity is a social process. It's not the lone genius hiding. And the community that people build and are part of are really important. So Jeremy and I have been doing a little bit of stuff lately on Twitter and LinkedIn around Darwin. And people think of Darwin as he came up with the theory of evolution, but in fact, he exchanged letters with hundreds of other people. He was part of just like a whole social process. So one thing it didn't occur to me until now, reading the book, every single one of these 81 assignments described basically a little element of creativity as a social process, which is, to me, how the D.school sort of works. Any comments on that before we maybe start digging into some specific exercises or 81, I guess, creative acts, is that what we call them, assignments?
Yeah, I mean, creative acts like refers to the whole sort of, all of the ideas that are in the book, the assignments, and then also some of the essays. And actually, that title is very intentional, because we want learning and design. It is an active process, right? And so you actually, I think, were, the first to teach me about the difference between, like, acting your way into a new belief, right? As opposed to just trying to adopt that belief and then somehow your behavior, your actions will change. We really try to give people that experiential learning moment. So yeah, that idea of creative acts is like embedded in there. For the act part is significant in terms of the thinking behind what we put in the book.
Yeah. Well, that's the notion. The best way to change people's belief is to get them to act in that direction. Okay. So, and for those of you who have read the book or contributed to the book, since we've got a bunch of folks here who contributed to the books, please sort of chime in with questions about your favorite exercises. But let me start out and ask about some. But Jeremy, Susie, Catherine, maybe you can jump in as well too. So, well, why don't you maybe talk a little bit about the Monsoon Challenge? I got my Post-its here. That's a big one. So
That is a big one. Yeah.
Tell us about the Monsoon Challenge. That one's pretty cool.
The Monsoon Challenge is a fantastic challenge to do kind of like early on when you're getting your team together and you're trying to figure out a couple of things. One is just like, how does everybody work? How does everybody behave in a team? And it also drives home a very particular lesson, which I'll get to in a second. So in the Monsoon Challenge, you basically give people a week to come up with a very inexpensive way to capture as much rainfall as possible. And then you stage a monsoon with a set of sprinklers that you put up on ladders, and you give everybody the exact same amount of time, like 5 minutes, to capture as much water as they can. And what's fascinating, and I'll kind of give you all the secret, is that, there are groups that will spend their whole week planning and designing and drawing. And then there are teams that will be like, well, what do we have available? We have a sort of rough idea. Let's build it and test it. And almost inevitably, the teams that test it early in that week are the ones that wind up capturing the most water. And a lot of teams arrive at the moment of testing it, and the water falls, and all of a sudden they realize, oh, water's heavy, right? Water's 8 pounds a gallon. And they had come up with this, like, what they thought was a very elegant solution. They never put the actual physical medium in it. So it is just a very powerful way, especially because it's like a little bit of a competition moment, to recognize, like, if you don't test out your ideas early, you just don't know what the failure modes are. And that assignment came from Jim Patel and Scott Cannon in one of the very early iterations of the Design for Extreme Affordability class. And David Janka, who actually kind of tells the story about being both a student and an instructor, he talks about how there were the teams that would kind of win the challenge in terms of collecting the most water. But then there were always teams that were just exceptionally resourceful. Like there was a team that, went around, they decided they didn't want to spend their $20 budget, and they went around to all the local bars and restaurants in Palo Alto, and they collected left behind umbrellas. And then they used those umbrellas to be the water capture device. And they didn't win, but like, that is such a great idea.
Cool.
Right, for working especially in a low resource environment. What are the unconventional materials that might be at hand if you just simply go and scout for them and ask for them? So we see all kinds of creative behaviors arise in that assignment.
So I want to get to Letitia's assignment 43, since she thinks that's a really cool one, in a second. But there's certain principles that it seems like it runs through all the teaching and work that we do over and over again. And one is everything from working with students on any project that we do. I'm thinking of like, there's a tire changing exercise we do with a guy who used to be at NASCAR, to what you're talking about. There's the teams that stand around and talk and talk and talk and talk. And there's the ones that keep prototyping and trying it. And almost always the ones that keep prototyping and trying it, they tend to do better and learn more. Okay, so since Letitia brought this up, so assignment 43, experts' assumptions, is a great one. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so experts' assumptions is a great way to start to challenge what some of the orthodoxies in your particular topic might be, or your organization. So it's based on a practice, everybody's heard of brainstorming, right? But there's another practice called assumption storming, which is also extremely powerful. And you can use it at various stages in your work, but it's essentially, you list all of the assumptions that you might have gathered from kind of reading some of the expert literature, or watching documentaries, or doing research, or even just the sort of, ideas that are, embedded in your own organization. So, the example that I use in the book is like, if you're redesigning a library entranceway for your community, what are all the assumptions that you have about libraries? They have to be quiet. They're free for everybody. You have to have a library card. You have to have be vetted for that. There's an expert librarian who can help you. Like all the, it's like they provide computer access, right? There's a whole bunch of assumptions that you might list. Now, some of those might be completely factual and you kind of cluster those as facts, but then a lot might be opinions or guesses. Like that idea that a library has to be quiet, there's a tradition there, but is that still relevant? I don't know. That's kind of an opinion, right? And so
Right.
you might then selectively choose. There's a number of ideas in the opinions and guesses column that you should challenge a little bit. So you just flip those. You would say, I'm going to assume this is not true, and design, like, what would I design if this assumption were not true? And the process of naming things that you thought were kind of inviolable rules, but actually describing them as assumptions that are really guesses or opinions, that unlocks so much more creative space and so much more opportunity. And it's particularly helpful if you do that with your team or with your group or department, because I'm holding an assumption, you're holding a different assumption, Bob, Jeremy's holding a third assumption. And if we those are unintentionally creating these invisible constraints to our problem solving. And if we can actually surface those, then we can say, well, let's collectively say we're going to set that one aside right now and see what might happen in kind of a short ideation session.
All right, I want to just jump in here with a second. I'm the one kind of holding the torch of the questions, and folks are just chomping at the bit. So I'm going to
go.
Bob, you can veto it if you don't like it.
No, go.
But I love Eric asked the question: how's the best way to get past the morale hit of failure during when you're getting feedback on your work? How do you get past that morale moment? Love that. But Bob, you can veto it if you want.
Now go, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of responses, and I want to hear your thoughts too, Bob. I mean, for one, like I think learning how to take feedback is one of those really fundamentally essential skills. And there is actually a great assignment in the book. There's a couple about, how to stage a critique the way that we do at the D.school that helps kind of inure you to those slings and arrows of getting that feedback. And one of them was contributed by Scott Dorley. It's called the test of silence. And you don't put your name on the work. Nobody knows who's produced the work. And you put it into some kind of context. Like if you're working on an app, you have somebody literally like use the wireframe or use the experience. Everybody can see what's happening. And you're kind of taking it out of your own self and putting it into the room. And the reality is somebody's going to use that thing and you're not going to be there to tell them how to use it right. And so you have to learn what's the gap between the thing that you intended to put into the world and the way that somebody is actually interpreting it or experiencing it. And then the part of that question that I just love is like, that sometimes really hurts. Like when you have a real miss, it's like, it's okay to feel really bummed about that. And that's just a part of creative work. And one of the ideas that I put in one of the essays is it's called productive struggle, which comes from mathematics education. Actually, I think I first learned about this from Leticia, which is the idea that there are moments when you're learning or when you're creating that feel really bad, but it is actually the moment that you're learning the most. And that is where you're stretching and you're improving your skills to be able to get to the next level in terms of what you're producing. And so having that understanding that those moments that hurt, you're not trying to say they don't hurt. You're trying to say they hurt. And that means that I'm right in that zone where I'm learning to do this better, and have that moment where you can be like, it doesn't feel great, but this is an important moment in my development. And I'm going to actually try to seek that or not shy away from that in my next projects.
Well, so I love your take on this, because sometimes people will give talks about failure and talk how great it is. And my motto, and Diego Rodriguez and I still argue over who came up with this, I think it was him, is failure sucks but instructs. Like you have to acknowledge the pain. But one thing I think that helps a little bit, and I learned this from a theorist, Carl Weick, is that sometimes when people fail or succeed, a way to sort of change the conversation is to say, well, the question of whether or not you're succeeding or failing, or whether you're a success or a failure is not very interesting. The more interesting question is, what are you learning? Because sometimes when people succeed, they actually learn a lot less than when they fail. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I worry most when a team comes up with a really big early success in a class, and they don't learn anything after that. They just
they plateau, right?
So we worry as much about early success as we do about early failure.
Yeah.
Um,
But Bob, I wanted to say one more thing about failure since we're on the topic, which is that I think there is a little bit of a, like when we talk about failure in the educational context, we've constructed this really safe environment for people to fail. And I think that it's really worth pointing out that there are, I mean, one, like I do think people in organizations often overestimate the degree of risk associated with a small failure. But there is a little bit of a sort of mythology in Silicon Valley about like the best thing you can do is to fail, and then you're going to be, you know, like way more credible.
Right.
And that is true if you are financially comfortable, if you have some degree of stability in your life. And so I do think there's some interesting work to be done on like failure, like how do we get to sort of a situation where failure could be, those learning experiences around failure could be more equitable so that people of, you know, all types of backgrounds could be succeeding in these environments where rapid iteration, early failure could actually lead to greater success. And that is an area where I think we have some work to do kind of in the broader Silicon Valley environment.
Oh, that's excellent. So Jeremy, what else is striking you in the chat?
I've got to throw it out to my good friend, William Hardaway, who asked, he was the first one to ask a question. So I feel like we got to go for it. We got to give him his due. I'm trying to scroll back up to it. He says, I want to hear about how are you doing really and the different formats and shapes that takes. And I would just, by way of context, I would say, Will works in a university setting and he works on sensitive topics. So I'll let you take it, Sarah.
So that's number 34, right?
Number 34.
Thank you so much, Will, for asking that question. This is one of my, I mean, they're all my favorites, but this is one of my favorites. So How Are You Doing Really was developed by Julian Gorodsky, who had the honor of being the D shrink in the early days of the D.school. And he really is somebody who just pays attention to and understands that feelings matter in creative work and in building communities. And so How Are You Doing Really is a warm up where you have your group at the beginning of your class or your workshop or your conference come in and everybody takes a minute to write down on Post-its like how they're really feeling. And the important thing here is you have to model that as the leader. You have to say, you have to show a little bit of vulnerability about what's really going on for you. Had a tough day last week, I'm dealing with a situation with my mom's health, whatever it is, like you actually have to, get beyond that surface level. And then you put those different Post-its on your body and you walk around the room and you meet someone else who also now looks a little silly because they've got Post-its all over them. And you have that way of starting a conversation that doesn't start just at that very superficial level, but maybe could start with one of those things that you've written about that allows you to just connect in a deeper way. And I think I saw someone in the chat, it's scrolling so quickly, it's hard to keep track of, but I saw somebody mention psychological safety.
Yes.
And part of what you're trying to create in a group that's going to navigate a foggy problem, that's going to tackle something where the outcomes are uncertain, is you actually have to be building trust. And you can't build trust if you don't really know where people are at, right? And you don't really want people to be faking it and just putting on kind of a brave face, but then not really be paying attention, not really be tuning in. So How Are You Doing Really is one of those activities where, each individual is still in charge of how much they do or don't want to share. It's not meant to be like a reveal your soul in this, really uncomfortable way, but it's meant to just build those small connections. And you have those conversations in pairs, and then you don't necessarily, share with the whole group. And for me, like as somebody who's was a very shy kid and is very introverted, I tend to gravitate toward a lot of those paired activities to get a group going. There are wonderful sort of large scale energy building Stokes and other kinds of activities, but especially early in a group formation, I tend to gravitate towards those smaller, more personal connections.
So I love that. I think having taught with Jeremy, who is not as introverted as we are, to put it mildly, I think sometimes he has a hard time. Catherine's laughing because we teach together. But so I also want to put in a plug for the book, because I'm looking at How We're Doing Really now. And one thing about this book, having written, many books, and all my books are honestly as objects kind of ugly, if I would tell you the truth. This book is so beautiful. So I'm just looking at page 116 and 117 in the drawings of these people with the Post-it notes glued upon them. I care too much about Instagram. I'm scared of flying. I worry I'm too sarcastic. It's so beautiful just as an object. And I have no idea how Sarah and team made it through a publisher and had produced such a beautiful book, but just as an object, it's just a lovely thing to own. And I guess I am trying to get you to order it, but I paid my own money for it. I did not get a free book, and I'm glad that I did. All right. So
Bob, pause real fast.
Yes.
We got 10 minutes left. I want to give Bob and Sarah a moment just to catch their breath real fast. You can look through the chat. That's one thing I have found in these sessions is there's so much chat. And especially when I'm the one speaking, it's like, I feel like I got to stay on the line for like 30 minutes just to read it all. It's like, they're talking to me. I want to see what they're saying. So Bob, Sarah, take one moment in the chat. Okay, you get one moment and collect your thoughts. What's the last question you want to answer?
There's so much amazing stuff in here. I saw someone said, fail in practice, not in the game. And I really love that. There was another comment in here that was about, it's hard to kind of seek feedback when you're wired for validation. And I mean, wow, that is like a really profound
Stanford culture.
It's Stanford culture. It's culture. It's, how many likes do I get on Instagram culture? And I think that's, I mean, part of what we're trying to do at the D-School in general is like, as somebody who is going to try to creatively solve challenges throughout your entire life, you want to rewire yourself to be a learner, right? You need to be able to know that you have a way to learn at any stage in your life about a new problem or challenge. I mean, look, in the last 19 months, all of us have been solving challenges that none of us were trained for, right? That has required an enormous amount of, like resilience and ability to show up actively and creatively in these very difficult challenges. And so that idea of like, can I, push back on that wiring that we all have around seeking validation and instead seek feedback, seek ways to improve, seek ways to strengthen my own learning. That's what gives you the ability to persist through these kinds of hard challenges and creative opportunities that we all need to address.
Wow. Well, I have a question, Sarah, which you just sort of prompted in me, and we're doing this right now. So the last, as you say, 18 months. So you've been finishing this book and you've been leading an organization that's gone through this, the pandemic, remote work, on and on. So what did you learn that you're going to bring back to the D-School when we're meeting in person now?
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I think for me, one of my core values has been really clarified in this around how to do this kind of work. And especially in this kind of community, in this period of time. And, you're right. Like I spent a lot of time working with this material, writing, rewriting, talking to the illustrator, talking to the contributors. And, during that same period of time, we had this major global pandemic. We had, uprisings around racial injustice. We had terrible forest fires. It's like on and on and on.
And on.
And so there were these moments where I was like, wow, the material that I'm working with is so joyful and so inspiring and so full of life and optimism and the idea that people can creatively change what the future is going to look like. And that at moments felt like very far away from the context. And I think what that helped me clarify is that I have a strong belief that that kind of optimism and joy and playfulness is what is required to address these kinds, to sustain us as we're trying to address these very serious, big challenges, whether we're trying to drive growth for our company or try to work on climate change or whatever our particular set of goals are. And so I think I came out of this period really recognizing that those two, for me and at the D-School, play and serious work absolutely go together. Yeah. And that I found some sort of new conviction around that. And I want to talk about that everywhere I go.
Well, that's lovely. So one sort of, I don't know how much time, but one final thing I want to make sure that we touch on is that part of building a community is Sarah's book, Yes Alone, it's sort of like a totem. It's a sign of the community that she helps build and tends to, but it's just the first in a series of books. In fact, I see some authors on my screen here. So tell us about the series that this is part of.
Yeah, well, at the D.school, we've been spending like the last 10, 15 years just kind of trying to show up for all of the folks who are, really eager to learn along with us. And we have been sitting on, I think one day somebody described it as like a mountain of content and ideas. And actually relatively few of those core ideas have we like been able to kind of put into a shareable form. And so we have, so this book is the first of 12 that will be coming out.
Wow.
And we have some of those other authors, as you mentioned here today. Susie Wise has just written a book called Design for Belonging, which is incredible and so needed at this moment. Leticia, who I saw at least at the start, is working on a book that's all about reflection and how to experiment with how you think about designing reflection tools for yourself and a bunch of the science behind it. And it's you're gonna just love it. We have a book on courage. We have a book on maps and data visualization and telling stories with data. There's so much more to come. So you can actually find all of those described at, and Sam and Tunde, their book Creative Hustle is part of that series. So all of those, the first 4 in the series are now available for pre-order, and you can actually look at that as a whole bundle, which gives a really healthy discount. So if you go to dschoolbooks.com.
Oh, good. We got a plug. Look at that.
I know all of that.
Link.
I just dropped in the chat, Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Yeah. So Bob and Sarah, if you don't mind, perhaps put your screens in gallery view so that you can see everyone. And folks, as we've started doing at the end of these sessions, could we give Bob and Sarah some fireworks applause? Would you join me in giving fireworks applause?
Thank you.
Amazing conversation. We're truly grateful and thankful for you sharing your input, your insights, and your expertise. World-renowned leaders sharing amazing inspiration with us today. We couldn't be more grateful.